6 Neanderthals from Goyet Cave in Belgium were not simply found dead. Their bones were cut, broken open, and in a few cases turned into tools. For more than a century, the fragments sat inside museum collections, mixed with animal remains from a cave excavated in the 1860s, until modern DNA, isotope chemistry, and microscopic analysis pulled a darker pattern out of the drawers. These were not random victims. The newest study argues they were outsiders, mostly women and children, brought into a cave where their bodies were processed like prey. When we think about Neanderthals, we tend to look at stone tools, heavy brows, and the old question of why they vanished. But there is another question hiding in the caves of Europe. What did Neanderthals do to each other when the world around them was shrinking? Goyet is not a neat crime scene. It is a complicated cave system near Namur, in the Mosen Basin of Belgium, excavated in 1868 by Edouard Dupont and revisited by researchers long after the original dig. Its layers hold traces from different periods: animal bones, stone tools, later human remains, and, among them, the largest known collection of Neanderthal fossils in Northern Europe. That messy history matters because the cave does not give us a single frozen moment. It gives us a puzzle rebuilt from fragments. In 2016, researchers identified 99 Neanderthal remains from the Troisième caverne of Goyet, radiocarbon dated to about 40,500 to 45,500 years ago, and they saw unmistakable signs of butchery. Then in 2025, a new team went further, asking not only what happened to the bones, but who those people were. The answer turns Goyet from a grim footnote into something more unsettling: a glimpse of social violence among the last Neanderthals of Northern Europe. The first clue is almost absurdly modern. The breakthrough did not come from a fresh excavation. It came from old fragments in storage. The Goyet collection had been handled, sorted, labeled, and reinterpreted for generations, because 19th century digs often kept spectacular objects but lost the exact positions that modern archaeologists would record. That means the researchers had to work like forensic specialists with half the room missing. They used direct radiocarbon dates, DNA, bone shape, CT scans, and isotope measurements, building a profile from splinters that would have looked almost useless to earlier scholars. The second clue is what the bones refuse to be, because several fragments first thought to belong to later humans turned out to be Neanderthal. A jaw fragment and tooth were identified in 2004. Then the 2016 reanalysis expanded the sample dramatically, showing that Goyet was not a minor find but a major northern archive of Neanderthal bodies. And here is the strange part: the Neanderthal bones were not treated like a burial. At nearby Spy Cave, some late Neanderthal remains may have been protected quickly after death, suggesting a very different handling of the dead. But at Goyet, the pattern looks brutally practical. The third clue is the cut marks, because they sit where butchers cut when removing flesh. Researchers found traces linked to skinning, filleting, disarticulation, and marrow extraction, the same kinds of marks seen on horse and reindeer bones from the cave. This is why the case for cannibalism became so strong. If the bones had been chewed by carnivores, cracked by falling rocks, or mixed by water, the damage would look different. But the Goyet fragments carried percussion pits, impact scars, and fractures made while the bones were still fresh. The most uncomfortable detail is that the Neanderthal bones match the food waste. Femurs and tibias, the rich long bones packed with muscle and marrow, were processed intensely, just as the high-value animal bones were processed, which is why researchers describe the most direct explanation as nutritional cannibalism rather than a symbolic ritual. The fourth clue is even stranger: some of the bones were used again. At Goyet, several Neanderthal bone fragments had patterns showing they served as retouchers, tools used to shape or sharpen flint flakes. That does not tell us whether the act was symbolic, practical, or both, and the scientists are careful about that. But the freshness of the bone blanks suggests the makers likely knew they were holding human remains, which makes Goyet different from simple scavenging and different from a normal disposal of the dead. Then comes the fifth clue, the one that changed the whole story. The victims were not a normal slice of a community. The 2025 study identified a minimum of 6 individuals for adult or adolescent females and 2 male children, one of them a newborn. If a cave simply preserved whoever died nearby, you would expect a rough mix of adult males, adult females, and children. Goyet does not look like that. It looks selective, and the adult or adolescent females were short, lightly built, and not close relatives of one another. This is where the story shifts, because the evidence is not just about cannibalism, it is about selection. The people represented in the cave were the kinds of individuals most likely to be vulnerable in a violent encounter, and that makes the assemblage look less like a famine accident and more like targeted predation. The 6th clue comes from chemistry, because bones carry the signatures of the landscapes that fed a body. Sulfur isotope values from the Goyet Neanderthals did not match the local animal remains from the cave region, which means the victims were probably not local inhabitants of Goyet. At the same time, their chemical signals were similar to each other, and their carbon and nitrogen values suggest broadly similar diets. Put together, the evidence points toward outsiders who may have come from the same group, or from groups living in a similar environment away from the cave valley. That is where the phrase exocannibalism enters the story, meaning the consumption of people from outside one's own group. In later human records, exocannibalism is often tied to warfare, competition, punishment, or the display of power, and while we cannot simply project those meanings onto Neanderthals, the comparison helps explain why the Goyet pattern feels so deliberate. The 7th clue is the hardest one because it asks who did this. In 2016, researchers argued that Neanderthals were the most likely processors, since no modern humans were securely known in the region at the same time, and the bone retoucher practice fits other Neanderthal contexts. The 2025 study is more careful, because Homo sapiens were appearing elsewhere in Europe during this broad period, including at Ronnez in Germany, roughly 600 kilometers to the east. So early modern humans cannot be ruled out completely, but the authors still consider conflict between Neanderthal groups the more likely explanation for what accumulated at Goyet. That nuance matters, because the easy version of this story would turn Neanderthals into monsters. The better version is more disturbing, because it makes them more human, living in small groups, defending territory, recognizing outsiders, and possibly using violence in ways that were social, selective, and meaningful. The revelation of Goyet is not that Neanderthals were savage, it is that they were varied. Within a few hundred kilometers of the cave, late Neanderthal remains show very different treatments of bodies, some possibly buried or protected, some fragmentary, and at Goyet, butchered and reused. So the old picture of one simple Neanderthal way of life breaks apart.